lot of mountain running, the biggest complaint that we see is knee pain, knee dysfunction. And so we're interested in saving our knees and still being able to run long distances over various terrain. And in order to save our knees, we need to be very aware of the mechanics of the whole chain and this hinge joint that kind of gets caught in the middle between two very mobile joints, the foot ankle and the hip. And so in this video, we're really going to focus up at the hip and look at the mobility that is necessary for healthy hip, healthy knee, but also the control of the hip that helps with our alignment and tracking of the knee. And if we use our hip more uniformly and all around, we'll be less prone to just isolating and using single muscle groups and kind of overusing those and developing quad issues, IT band syndrome, things like that. Okay, Joe, so you're going to start lying down flat on your back.
Okay.
Your knees will be bent and your feet will be on the floor. In order for us to understand how our hip control and mobility affects our knee, we need to know what kind of range of motion we're needing to control at our hip.
Okay.
And so this exercise we call pelvic clocks, and it's kind of an exploration of all the different planes of motion that our hip and low back can move into that can help us learn and educate our movement out on the trail. But also, it's really like a therapeutic thing to do because it moves and almost like massages the joints in our hip sockets and in our lumbar spine. So we're going to use this little prop to help to explain the direction of action or motion at the hip and also just give you a little visual of the kind of segment of the body that we're trying to move.
Okay.
So if I place this pelvic clock on your pelvis, there's a directionality where 12 o'clock is towards your sternum and 6 o'clock is towards your pubic bone, and then 9 o'clock is on this crest and 3 o'clock is on this other hip crest.
Okay.
And we're just going to move your clock between 12 and 6 o'clock, so it's going to look like you are tipping your pelvis up and therefore kind of rounding your low back a little bit,
okay.
And then you're going to move in the other direction and your low back will arch,
okay.
And your pelvis will tip down towards the floor. And you'll just go back and forth a few times.
Okay.
And this is something that we usually have to kind of control a little bit when we're running, right? We don't want to be
sure.
overarched or over tucked. And so what we want to explore is what feels like neutral to you, and then also how much of a dance can we create in that motion if we need to, given the demands or the terrain. So a couple other motions that we're a little less aware of and are a little bit more subtle to feel are these rotational motions and the side bend motions of our hip. So Joe's going to take this direction idea and he's going to tip the 3 and 9 o'clock aspect of his pelvis down while the other lifts, and then the other side drops while the opposite side raises. So it's a rotation of the spine and the pelvis around this long axis through your trunk. Yeah, really subtle and micro, but
pretty tight to the right.
Exactly. You might find some asymmetries or be tight on one side, and that might say something about how your hip is feeling or how your knee is feeling. So you want to create symmetry in the rotation and kind of feature that's happening at your hip from right and left. So go ahead and just try a few more. So the other action at the hip that is more elusive for us, but is really important for this concept of saving your knees on the downhill, is this idea of the mobility and control of our side bend or our hip hike. And so you're going to action your hips as if you're spinning a record on a turntable. And you're going to just take and lift and lower 3 and 9 o'clock towards the armpit and away from the armpit, while keeping your knees nice and parallel and stationary. And that isolates this kind of adduction and abduction at your hip joint, and then some side bend of your lumbar spine. So with all of these actions of the hip, it's important that you're using your muscles below your belt to generate these movements. So you really don't want your back to be that involved or your waist muscles. So it's really kind of the back and particularly your glute and hamstring connection right at the sits bones that you're using to kind of tone and generate these motions from low down at the base of your hips versus everything kind of happening in your waist, abs, and low back.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to take what we just learned lying down about our pelvic planes of motion, and we'll apply it to running which is a activity we're spending a lot of time on one leg, and that's the essence, is we really have to control everything in that moment when we're on that standing leg, particularly on the downhill when we're attempting to navigate the terrain.
Awesome.
So go ahead and just choose a foot on the block.
Okay.
The action I'm most interested in identifying in standing is this, what we call like a pelvic hike or a hip hike.
Okay.
And so this is the one that we want to know about and control and use to our advantage. So you're just going to move your pelvis in that way that lifts and lowers it. So the free foot is kind of changing its altitude, but the action is not happening from a waist scrunch. It's happening from the standing leg, lateral hip muscles working like a piston system to lift and lower the pelvis. And it's actually something that you might want to use as a strengthening tool to strengthen this lateral hip to avoid things like IT band syndrome and patellofemoral pain. Switch sides and just try a couple lifts on that other side.
All right.
And what you might find curious is that each side might be a little asymmetric, like Joe's realizing that his right hip is a little tighter and it kind of splays out a little, and he might have better control on his left hip. And so that might speak to something going on his right side that needs to be addressed to avoid an injury in the future. So this is a chance to take inventory, to strengthen, and also to cue your body for what we're about to see. When we pull these pieces together, we'll look at how this applies to downhill.
Okay.
So in addition to the lateral or side hip muscle strength that we just went over with that list concept, we also really need to access our backside and the posterior muscles, mostly our glute max and hamstring, to do a lot of the control work and power work when we're running, and be less reliant on our quad and front hip flexors, because those get overused and can cause some problems downstream at the knee. So we're going to look at squats using a roller at the wall, which just helps us have nice form and control so we can really detail what we want to feel. You might have something sticky on the floor like a yoga mat, just so you're not sliding. Place the roller at your low back and have your feet pretty far out in front of you so that when you go into your squat, your knees aren't traveling way over your toes.
Okay.
And you're just going to roll down into some squats. And what I want you to feel here, Joe, is your backside doing the pushing up.
Okay.
And also kind of doing the slow lower down. Mm-hmm. So if you pretended that you didn't have knees for a second and all you had were your hips, you would have to do all of this work with hip flexion and hip extension.
Okay.
And so you really want to focus your effort on this backside. And you can even feel right behind at the high point of your thighs, that tone and that kind of like bulk of muscle and tendon. And that's what you want to have working. So we're going to put this together in a second on this downhill concept. So what I want you to feel is if you just maybe move to your right leg towards midline,
okay,
and adjust to do a single leg version of this,
okay,
it's really going to put the work in that backside. And the thing that you want to be really careful of is just alignment, right? So that pelvic clock is relatively neutral here, and you're square through your hip bar. And then you really want that knee tracking right over your second toe and having nice parallel alignment through your femurs and legs, and that'll help your hip and your knee. If you have a lot of diving inward of the knee, that could be problematic on the knee over time. Ultimately, to save our knees, especially on the downhill, but in mountain terrain in general, we don't want our knees going through a lot of deep bending, because that's really hard on the joint. The more it bends, the more the forces kind of increase, particularly against kneecap, against femur. But we also don't want the knee to do a lot of diving inward. So we have to have control at our hip to align the femur and the knee with the foot ankle. And we also have to have mobility and play so we can dance and not be too rigid, because that causes other problems, right? Too much shock and load. So we're going to use this little yoga block to kind of just be a step that we'll use to use our posterior side, our back side, to kind of control the single leg squat that happens when we're running. And then we'll use that list to lengthen our leg out so it meets the ground sooner, so that our knee has to bend less. Okay, so go ahead and step up on the block. We'll put our pelvic clock back on. And we're going to combo two things, and these are the things we just did in the exercises. One is the single leg squat with the roller idea, using the backside to do a little mini squat. And if Joe kept squatting and bending his knee to get down, his knee would end up bending maybe more than it needs to. So we can add in this other feature of kind of extending the length of the free leg by adding in that pelvic list. And the thing that you want to do is really, even though you're listing your hips and your pelvis, you still want to keep that knee tracking over the second toe. So this combo of posterior kind of deceleration into the step down and also a little extension of the free leg with the list helps to save our knees.
Okay. And obviously we're not demonstrating the full form here, we're just isolating it to show specifically what muscles we're engaging.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's a little contrived in this gym environment to learn and recognize what our weaknesses are. And then we take it to the trail and we have more organic freestyle movement. But the main thing is you need to have some control and some mobility to create that nice dance.
Awesome.
Okay, go ahead and switch sides. And you might recognize that one side is easier or harder to accomplish this on, but mostly you want that nice hip fold. And you want to really try to keep that femur tracking over the second toe. And then this just acts like a little bit of a telescope just to lengthen that leg out a little longer so it meets the ground sooner, saving that knee from more excess bending. And then try to keep your trunk square. So if you had a bar at your shoulders, it wouldn't rotate with you.
Right. So obviously things will look a little bit different when we're out on the trail. Movement's going to be more fluid, and but there's a real importance to practice these exercises in the gym to be able to kind of isolate what muscles we're using, so then when we get out on the trails we can kind of forget about the specifics of the isolated muscles and just be able to run downhill more fluidly.
Nice. Yeah, and we really just peeled out a couple concepts and a couple exercises. That's a pretty vast topic, and there's a lot of fine-tuning. We wanted to give you guys these two ideas. One is the lateral hip muscle strength and your hip mobility and control, and then also the posterior backside hip muscle strength to try to offset the dominance that we get in our quadricep and front hip flexors, TFL, and those muscles that end up driving more of our knee problems. So hopefully you guys feel a little bit inside and then kind of set yourself free and have some nice fluid organic movement out on the trail.